So yeah, it's our pleasure to introduce Woodrow Rosenbaum, Chief Data Officer at GivingTuesday. So we've heard a lot about how to cultivate donors and just that donor retention process. And now we're going to just take a step back, looking back at 2020 and all of the lessons that we learned about digital fundraising in the time of COVID. And so Woodrow is the founder and CEO of With Intent, an international consumer marketing agency, and he has a long history of building top consumer brands. Woodrow's helped companies and brands to define strategies, develop new business, and expand their markets. And in the nonprofit sector, he has conducted research and analysis of individual giving behaviors, engaged with thousands of charities regarding fundraising strategies and trends, and has engaged millions of donors on topics related to giving and volunteering through traditional and social media. So welcome, Woodrow.
Thanks, Jenna. It's good to be here. I was looking at your schedule, and there's a lot of great speakers that you guys have lined up, and some friends. So it's good to see. It's a really good lineup. So thanks for including me. I appreciate it. I'm going to get right into it because I know people are going to be eager to hear the trends, and in particular the most immediate trends. But I should probably just quickly do a quick overview of GivingTuesday and our approach, and why I'm the one talking about this to begin with. I'll mention the Q&A panel is a great way to get your questions in, and the CauseVox team will make sure that we get to those questions. I'm happy to get kind of interrupted if there's something immediate that's not clear. Otherwise, we can review some of these findings and dig deeper where people are interested. But first, just very top line, it's kind of important to know, because I think most people probably know GivingTuesday as that day after Thanksgiving, Black Friday, and Cyber Monday, when people around the world celebrate generosity. And we see a lot of organizations activating and peer-to-peer fundraising, and lots of money donated, and lots of other acts of kindness and giving. GivingTuesday is also a year-round movement to encourage and celebrate generosity in all of its forms, and to build capacity within the social and civil sector to empower people to use their generosity to create the communities that they want to live in. And we do this through a distributed network. So there is a core organization based in the US that supports the many different factors around this work, and supports our global and community movements. We have over 75 official global movements. There's activity in every country of the world every year. But that distributed network really co-creates in a interconnected peer learning environment GivingTuesday, the campaign, the best practices, and the understanding of generosity. And that's where I come in. Our mission with the GivingTuesday Data Commons began as an initiative just to measure what was happening on the day on GivingTuesday. And then beyond that, how was the movement transforming organizations and communities through the innovation and experimentation and interventions that they were deploying. And we've now grown beyond that to really be about understanding trends in generosity, how these pro-social behaviors interconnect and interact, and how we can motivate and increase the impact of people's generosity around the world. So to do that, we have over 100 organizations in the US working with us, sharing data, best practices, within 8 working groups looking at various aspects of giving. And we have teams in nearly 50 countries that we're supporting their efforts, both on a global and regional and national level, to stand up philanthropic data infrastructure and understand giving in that broad global context, both to empower those places, but also to learn from them so that we can inspire greater cultures of giving around the world. So with that lens, we've been building more and more research opportunities and resources and data collection to understand what the trends are, and really try to get high fidelity view of those trends so that we can provide actionable insights to the sector. And I'm going to talk about donation results, and we've got a number of data sources for those looking back at 2020. Key to that is our relationship with the Fundraising Effectiveness Project, where we are now collaborating to analyze those data and do quarterly reporting. We are increasing the number of different dimensions that we include in that report, as well as the tools for examining it. And it was one of the key data assets that we used to explore giving in 2020, which really was a unique year. You may have noticed things are a little bit different in 2020. So I'll cover, first of all, what we saw there and what we think it means for giving, and opportunities and risks looking forward into 2021 and beyond. So first of all, one of the key things that we saw with 2020 was that donor mobility was really much higher, much more volatile than we'd ever seen before. So overall, we saw acquisition was up. So it's meant more donors in the ecosystem, but also just organizations had a higher level of donor acquisition than we'd seen in many, many years. At the same time, retention of donors was down. And despite that, recapture of lapsed donors was also up, and in fact, very lucratively so. And overall, what we saw there was multi-year trends in giving that were completely reversed and disrupted in 2020, which is important to understand and identifies perhaps some opportunities for the sector moving forward, although also obviously a lot of risk inherent with that kind of unpredictable and volatile marketplace. When we look at this overall, we see that in 2020, giving was up. Dollars raised in 2020 were higher than dollars raised in 2019. But that wasn't a consistent thing. So we saw peaks and valleys, but overall a net upward trend, which is not earth-shattering, but interesting. But when we dig deeper, we see that there's a lot of turbulence below that more placid surface. So first of all, as I mentioned, that donor mobility thing, typically in every year that we look at, going back to 2005, we see that that donor growth and donor retention are highly correlated. That donor retention was the foundation of donor growth. And there are two exceptions to that, 2019 and 2020. So it was really interesting to see that in 2019, we could have high retention without corresponding donor growth. And in 2020, we saw exactly the opposite. We saw growth while retention dropped substantially. This is really important to understand, that this volatility means that some of the factors that we always saw as correlated, turns out they don't have to be. And this is, I think, important as fundraisers and as we engage donors and peer-to-peer fundraisers to think about sometimes, this idea that if we just maintain retention, everything else will be fine is not necessarily true, and that we can actually have net growth without that high retention. So what does that mean? The other impact and the other sort of key finding from 2020 was overall market volatility. And this is partly driven by this high mobility of donors. The overall sector results don't look like the typical result for organizations, and a lot of factors disrupting those organizations and their ability to fundraise effectively. That agility and ability to pivot was really key. And some business models for fundraising and engagement of donors were just more impacted than others. If you were very dependent on live event and had to suddenly pivot away from that, that's pretty challenging, right? I mean, you see, even in large organizations, if there was a very, years and years, you've been doing the same, your major fundraising event is a big marathon run, and otherwise you do major donor stewardship, and then suddenly you're going to your Facebook intern and saying, we have $15 million we have to make up. Like, you're not going to have a good time. And we definitely saw that at every level of organization kind of capacity, there were various challenges. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But first, when we look at the growth by cause area, we see that not all causes showed growth. So although the net result was up, that wasn't true for every cause area. And human services was really the one area where where we saw a net increase over above all others. But even this is really hiding some other volatility, because the typical experience was worse than that. Only human services showed lift in median, right? So on average, more of those cause areas were up. But the median organization by cause area here, only human services was up. And the best you could hope for was kind of break even for, looking more or less like it did in 2019. A lot of cause areas showing contraction. And in fact, what we see is that despite this overall lift, most organizations showed contraction. So this really is a story of winners and losers within that overall lifted environment. And we see a similar disparity by organization size. So the average, every size category up at least a little, but the median, the typical experience by organizations, is flat or contraction. And we saw small organizations having particularly struggling within that. So that winners and losers environment, we saw somewhat in line with societal changes, right? So we saw people mobilizing their giving to cause areas in need, and thus, health and human services both showing growth, things like arts and culture showing really clear decline. And that definitely was part of the story of either success or failure, but it doesn't tell the whole story. It's not just about donors moving. There's other factors at play, one of which is whether organizations were active. And this is something that our platform partners were telling us early on in the pandemic, like shortly after we started seeing lockdowns, shutdowns, was that a lot more organizations were just not fundraising. And there are a number of factors that contribute to that. Just again, that ability to pivot was one of the key components, right? If you weren't ready, if you weren't digitally ready in particular, it was a real challenge to make that shift. We also heard a lot from platforms and organizations and groups that they felt like it was a bad time to be fundraising because people were worried about their own finances and concerns about their communities and uncertainty. And we really think that that was a misunderstanding of the relationship that we have with supporters, because in our surveys, what we found was a highly motivated donor community, very responsive. And in fact, the more concerned they were about things in their communities, the more likely they were to be giving. And that people really were thinking about their generosity and their giving as an opportunity to have agency about those things that they care about. But overall, the impact of these variety of factors driving an unprecedented number of organizations to not fundraise at all is this pattern we see here, where 2019 is pretty typical, right? There's always some organizations that fundraised the year before that are not there. And this is always particularly true for small organizations. Like we see more churn in that small organization category, but it was at least double. Those small organizations really dropping out of the pool entirely for those variety of reasons. And typically what we see is, by the time we get to the giving season in December, pretty much everybody's in the market. And 2020 didn't look like that at all. Unprecedented numbers of organizations doing no fundraising whatsoever. And all we managed to do was kind of flatten that curve by the end of the year, rather than see everybody back in action. And yet those organizations that were active and present found that they were getting a pretty good result because of that really motivated donor community. So that capacity to pivot, and having diverse ways of engaging donors and a willingness to be active are really key factors in both immediate result and ongoing resilience. What we've seen from our look back at multi-year data is that diverse funding sources and having small donors as part of your support ecosystem are really critical to weathering various economic shocks. So we've been thinking about how can we best support and strengthen the sector? How can we help to help the sector to be resilient and recover from some of the downturn effects of 2020, while at the same time take advantage of some of the opportunities that this presents, which we think are significant. So giving moments was a clear driver in 2020. And we think that this is really pointing to a best practice, that we have these motivated givers, they want to respond, and that giving moments provide that opportunity, and that they in particular drive participation and acquisition. So over the course of 2020, we see some of that being cause related. We see moments driving people's response, partly, I think, because of the need that's so obvious, and partly because then the organizations in those categories are active at that time, and that means they're engaging. And they are perhaps more likely to feel like they have a compelling story to tell. And we see this very strongly driven by COVID. We see this also driven by social and racial justice causes, for example, and these things kind of emerged and then would wane and then sometimes come back again over the course of the year. And you can see that track against kind of what's going on in our environment and events that are occurring. It's not all about being the relevant cause, though. I think one of the things that we were saying early in 2020 was all organizations have a COVID story. And I think that this is, again, a kind of a best practice in looking forward, is that all organizations have a story of how they connect with community and how they're part of healing and recovery. And one of the ways that we see this play out is on Giving Tuesday. Now, last year we had the first time ever we did an extra Giving Tuesday. And it was very informative. It was a great opportunity to learn, because we announced that with very little notice. We had made the decision about 4.5 weeks in advance, and we announced it 2-3 days later. And we saw activity and action across the country and around the world, and by every cause area. And for a lot of organizations, I think it was an opportunity. They felt like it was an opportunity to get back in the conversation. I think that they were missing the opportunity before. Nevertheless, it gave them something to pivot around. And this is a really indicative chart, I think, because this is percentage of new donors acquired by day. This is a fairly canonical time series. This shows environment and animals, which is an interesting one because the environment and animals didn't have a great year, and in part probably because it wasn't sort of considered a really relevant cause area, or perhaps because they didn't consider themselves a relevant cause area. The pattern you're seeing on these spikes we see for every cause area in the US. Little bit more noise for some other cause areas where there's other events kind of driving things, but everybody shows these same 3 spikes. December 31st, end of year, always a big day. Part of that is false. Part of that is just a lot of donations get flagged as December 31, even though they happen at another time. What's interesting with our Giving Tuesday analysis every year is we have the opposite problem, because we know that there are some donations that are happening or motivated by Giving Tuesday campaigns and by that opportunity to give, but they're dated some other day or they come in later. And so we know that our results are always a sort of minimum estimate. And what you see here is that the 2 big spikes prior to the end of the year are Giving Tuesday now in May, and Giving Tuesday is December 1st is the biggest day for new donor acquisition in the entire year. That was true across cause areas, as I said. And so what this really shows us is that we can create these moments that are motivating for people to give. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that you're the cause célèbre at the time, that there is opportunity to drive those moments regardless. And this really showed up in the social media discourse and in our survey work, where we saw the dominant theme around generosity and around Giving Tuesday was related to community. And we see that reflected in behavior and people responding to and supporting everybody within their community, and thinking really broadly about who that is, including things like donating money to small businesses, a category that prior to 2020 really wasn't a thing. But in 2020, I mean, look, it's not as big as people giving to homeless shelters or, health and human services, but that wasn't a thing really before 2020. And I think the fact that people and I'm not talking about shop small, I'm not talking about buying gift cards, I'm talking about just donating money to small businesses, either directly or through funds. And I think that really is indicative of how people have been thinking about all of the people and organizations and causes within their community and how they want to see them survive and uh, be part of that fabric and be resilient. And so I think as organizations and causes, we can take this and recognize that there is an opportunity for everybody to tell that story about how they're part of that community fabric. So looking forward to this year and what that means. Um, First of all, creating and sharing those giving moments we really think is what is going to be a critical tool. Not retreating, recognizing that your role is to give people an opportunity to take action for good, as opposed to this sort of old school view of scarcity where you think of you're there to sort of impose upon people to ask them to do something when times are tough. If you think about yourself instead as an opportunity for them to have agency, that's already going to put you in a better relationship. And then recapturing, we think, is going to be a big opportunity in 2021, because as we maybe get back to a little bit more of a normal marketplace, those lapsed donors that dropped off in 2020, we think it's going to be important to try to re-engage them. And so what do we see at the beginning of 2021 that can help kind of identify whether we're on track? So first quarter results are looking pretty interesting, and there's some really good news in here so far. First of all, donors and dollars are up. Great news. We're very excited to see that. You can get the full report in a lot of depth on givingtuesday.org/data. But this is, top line metrics. We've got some confidence bands in there. So donors are up 10%, plus or minus 2%, and dollars are up similarly 6% with the same kind of confidence range. But when we dig a little bit deeper, we see something a little more interesting happening, because as I said, when we look at the retention and acquisition behavior in 2020, it really was quite unprecedented. And overall, retention is looking interestingly strong in 2021. And in particular, I want to draw attention to this new donor retention. Highest ever new donor retention ever recorded in a first quarter. Now, what this means, first of all, just to define that, we're talking about donors who were newly acquired by an organization in 2020, came back and gave again in the first quarter of 2021 at a higher rate than we have ever seen. So what does that mean? I think one of the big questions was, is this crisis giving? Is it going to wane? Is this like a disaster relief effort and then people go back to doing something else? Maybe. But so far, what we're seeing is that at the very least, these people are still in the fight with the organizations and causes that acquired them. And that is a really strong sign, and obviously an opportunity to maintain that engagement. And our advice there is engage frequently, tell the story a lot, give people many ways to support you, not just through donation, and make them a partner in your effort. So that's one side of the coin, is those new donors. We've reversed the trend for consolidation, and those people are still in the system. So this is great news. Keep them engaged, tell them lots of stories. The other side of this recapture question. Now, on the surface, this 12% drop in recapture rate looks pretty worrisome, right? But this is on top of a first quarter. This is compared to a first quarter of 2020, which was extraordinarily high, abnormally high. So this year over year difference is a little bit it looks more worrisome than it is, because we actually see a reasonably decent retention rate there, and so it's not so dire. It just is not as good as an unprecedented quarter. So is there room for improvement? 100%. Keeping in mind, there's lots of time still to recapture those donors. This is just first quarter. It's also based on partial data. I mean, a very big data set, a really big sample, but we know that there's more data to come, and that will drive that number up. So big opportunity there to have our cake and eat it too. to continue to engage these donors that were acquired in 2020 and to recapture the donors who moved on to something else in 2020 who are perhaps ripe to bring back. And in our initial look, it looks like we might be returning to a little bit more baseline with respect to kind of cause area and organization size. You'll remember I pointed out that those are critical factors in success in 2020. It's still important in 2021, but it's less abnormal. So we are seeing a little bit more of a return to that baseline and still retaining those donors. That's a really good opportunity. We think it bodes well for the sector as a whole moving forward. So as we continue through 2021, as I said, like engage, and think about being in a conversation, a dialogue with supporters, that you're there to give them agency to take care of the things that they're worried about, and that is a pretty broad spectrum of things. It's not just about the immediate cause. It's about lots of things. People are thinking about their immediate community and they're thinking about their global community, perhaps like they never have before. So we should tap into that dialogue and give people lots of opportunities to give, including giving their voice, including giving their time. Like the more ways you can give people to give, the better. One of the things that has been very clear from Giving Tuesday for years and years and years is that most people take more than one action. In the US, the most common way people participate in Giving Tuesday is giving money. But the least common behavior is only giving money. The vast majority of donors also take some other action. That's how your supporters want to be engaged. Don't think about those additional opportunities as more ask or burden. Thinking about it as a broader relationship with those donors. And I think that what you'll find is that provides a very strong basis for retention. So for us, what's next is we're looking more broadly at the overall generosity ecosystem. We are measuring more and more behaviors, and we're putting them in the same data environment so we can see how interventions, how events, how crises impact giving behavior more broadly than just donation, and including volunteering and other pro-social behaviors. We are looking at civic participation, how people build communities. We're mapping our own network and trying to understand better how best practice propagates through that network and how the network grows to inform our own practice, but also others who are interested in decentralized co-creation mechanisms for activating advocacy, activism, charity. And we're doing this in a global context. As I mentioned before, and I really just bears repeating, we are using our tools, our infrastructure, our expertise, our methodology to build capacity around the world. And at the same time, we don't see this as kind of the global north exporting to more developing economies. We have to learn from cultures of giving around the world if we're going to break out of limiting paradigms in the US and other more developed charitable sectors. So part of our objective here is going to be to very intentionally measure and understand those cultures of giving, how people are engaging mutual aid, unincorporated community care, et cetera, so that we can understand where the opportunities are for us to tap into those mechanisms for the betterment of our communities, for the empowerment of those givers, and yes, for a stronger, more resilient social and charitable sector in the US. So now we've got about 15 minutes. I saw some flashing, so I suspect there are some questions.
Yeah, Woodrow, thank you so much for that incredibly insightful presentation. I am really just intrigued by all the data that you've conducted. Is that specifically through Giving Tuesday, the research for all of that?
So yeah, I mean, we have collected data from about 74 different donation platforms, donor management software companies, payment processors, and then our relationship with the Fundraising Effectiveness Project means we're also mining the entire Growth and Giving data set, which goes back many years and has been stewarded by the AFP Foundation for years and years. So that collaboration allows us to build more. We're building more tools and analysis on top of that data set. and collaborating on the reports.
Incredible. Thank you so much for sharing. We do have a couple questions. Let's see if I can, I wasn't sure if there was one in the chat. Everyone who is still with us, feel free to send in a question in the Q&A if you're interested. I do have one, not to be polarizing by any means right now, but do you think that there was an influence from 2020 being an election year with candidates and PACs raising money? Do you think that influenced the data that you found?
I mean, the short answer is no. Although I will say we are examining this question a little bit more thoroughly right now, in particular trying to kind of tease out when political giving is kind of generosity and when it's something else and how it's viewed by the giver. And it's a fairly complex thing. But when looking back, we don't see a big influence of political giving on the overall results. I'll point out, first of all, our data that I shared today is mostly absent that political giving. So we don't see that we're not entirely, but it's mostly not in there. And so the actual lift you see is not driven by political giving for sure. The other question that we've often been asked is, does political giving kind of incentivize other giving, or does it cannibalize other giving? And the answer there seems to be no and no. That we don't see a big influence on, people giving to PACs, for example, doesn't seem to either drive or suppress giving to other things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks for that insight there. We have another question from Melissa. Do you have numbers on average retention rates for pre-2020 and post-2020 yet?
So just what I shared so Q1 is as far as we have numbers for 2021. And where we look at the average and the current rate and the year to date. And here, let's see if I can, some way I can get back to that other slide. Oh my goodness, that's the wrong way. Sorry, I normally have a whole studio, but I'm actually on vacation right now, so I don't have my stuff.
No problem. And of course, these slides, if it's okay with you, we can send these slides to our participants as well.
Yeah, so I mean, this shows retention time series. So the orange line is 2020. So that is versus 2019 and follows a fairly typical pattern. And then what we're seeing in the blue is what we're recording for the first quarter of 2021. Although it's important to note, and this is, we get into a little more depth here. If you look at the bar chart on the left, this is over the years. And so there is fair amount of volatility year over year, but but it smooths out quite a bit when you pull back more. And that error bar, that black bar you see in 2021 is because by the time we're reporting on 2021 Q1, we don't have full data yet. We have a lot, but we know there's a lot more to come in. And so where we're measuring right now is at about 0.5% retention. We actually expect that to maybe be as high as 1.5% in the first quarter of 2021. So we're looking good. Retention is the story of Q1. It's very strong compared to the previous years.
Awesome. Yeah, and for those who are looking for more of a deep dive into that retention data, you can definitely check out Stephen Shattuck's session at 4:45 today Eastern. So Stephen Shattuck is the Chief Engagement Officer at Bloomerang, and he's going to go over donor retention studies. So definitely stop in for that session if you're still interested. And I'm sure you can also take advantage of GivingTuesday's data from that link that we shared before, GivingTuesday Data Commons, which I'll put in the chat in a moment. And right now, I think we still have time for a couple more questions. So Jen said, you mentioned that we should give donors more agency and the chance to give more than just monetary gifts during these giving moments. What might that include?
So, I mean, the obvious ones are giving time. So ways that people can volunteer. It was very interesting when we looked at volunteer patterns in 2020 versus 2019 is that 2020 started behind 2019. And not a lot, but a little. It was a bit of a low year compared to the year before. Then we saw the shutdowns happen, and volunteer behavior just took a nosedive, which makes sense. People weren't doing events, so they couldn't go to the food bank and volunteer. Like, that stuff had all stopped, and it just plummeted. Very soon after that, though, what we saw was a recovery, not just to the baseline. So 2020 came up to meet the 2019 levels, but for a lot of cause areas was higher. And I think that was indicative of organizations, and our platform partners tell us this, like, rapidly trying to pivot to uh, online volunteering opportunities, and businesses using online volunteering as a way to engage with now a remote workforce. So why did that work so well so quickly? Well, I think in part because despite all of the disruption of that, virtual volunteering has a lower barrier. People are in front of their computers and you could reach anybody. Like, they don't have to be near your organization if you can find that opportunity for them. So all that is to say, just like other mechanisms, online, digital versus in person, think about hybrid models as much as possible in 2021. Giving stuff and then giving voice. Get people to talk about your cause. That is a key way to keep them engaged and make them feel like they're part of your team. And we see this in particular, people under 40 much more likely to take that action. I think that that millennial generation and younger recognize that their voice has value, that's one other way that they can help your organization, and that they don't see it as bragging. They see it as having as an asset that they can contribute to your cause. So don't let that go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like, from my own perception, I think just the encouragement is that people want to help. And this is such a subjective sector. This is something that comes from the heart. And so people want to help. And I think our job as nonprofit marketers and fundraisers is just to give them the ability to, in an easy, direct, and very, just rewarding way. And so I just want to thank you again so much, Woodrow, and to Giving Tuesday for partnering with us. This has been fantastic, and I just wanted to leave enough time to transition over to Candace before we start and break out for our lunch sessions. So thank you again so much.
Thanks, Jenna. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Woodrow. This was so cool. Such great data, right? Like, we need to be informed about the trends so that we can adapt to it. So really helpful. I really like just the idea of engaging volunteers during this time. And I think there's so many different ways organizations can do that and make it actionable and apply. It's not just, volunteer at the soup kitchen. There's tons and tons of ways you can engage volunteers, even with tasks that help you save time on just engaging with your networks, so really cool, really great session. Thank you so much, Woodrow.
Thanks, Candace.